There are secrets that survive fires. Secrets that outlast the people who buried them. The houses built on top of them and the families who swore generation after generation that they would never surface. And then there are secrets kept not in locked drawers or sealed letters, but in the quiet, methodical handwriting of a woman no one thought to watch. She was not a lawyer. She held no official title. She was never summoned before a judge, never asked to testify, never given a seat at a table where decisions were made. She was simply the woman who came when a child was about to enter the world, and she always brought her bag, her steady hands, and a small leather notebook that she never showed to anyone. For nearly 3 decades, she recorded everything, not because she was asked to, not because anyone told her it mattered, but because she understood something that the powerful men around her refused to acknowledge. That the truth about a person, about who they really are and where they really come from, is written in the first moment of their life. Before the lies begin, before the names are chosen for public consumption, before the family decides what version of events the world will be allowed to see, she wrote it all down. And when she died quietly in a small room at the back of a house she had served for 30 years, those notes did not die with her. What happened after her notebooks were found shook one of the most respected families in the state of Virginia to its foundation. It called into question the legitimacy of fortunes, marriages, inheritances, and reputations that had taken generations to build. It exposed the kind of truth that powerful men do not merely wish to suppress. They require to be suppressed because without that suppression, everything they are dissolves. This is the story of Harriet Voss, midwife, record keeper, and the most dangerous woman in Albemarle County, though no one knew it until she was already gone. Stay with us. Albemarle County, Virginia, autumn 1841. The Blue Ridge Mountains in October have a particular quality of light, amber and pale at the same time, as though the sun is already preparing to abandon the valley for another winter. The roads through Albemarle County in that season turned to mud after the first rains, and the farm hands who worked the outer properties of the large estates learned quickly that certain sounds carried farther in the cold air: the crack of wagon wheels against frozen ruts, the bark of a dog answering another half a mile away, and the particular rhythm of a woman walking fast with a leather bag. That rhythm meant someone was about to be born. Harriet Voss was 41 years old when she first came to work for the Langford family. She was not born in Albemarle County. She had come from a small settlement north of Charlottesville, where she had learned her trade from an older woman named Agnes, a midwife who had trained under a physician, and who believed that the difference between a living child and a dead one often came down to cleanliness, patience, and the refusal to panic. Agnes had passed her knowledge and her habits to Harriet with the same seriousness that a craftsman passes tools to an apprentice. Harriet was not a large woman. She was compact and deliberate in her movements, with hands that were always slightly roughened from washing. She was meticulous about that, more so than most, and a face that people consistently described in the years after her death, when anyone bothered to remember her as watchful, not unkind, not cold watchful, as though she was always paying attention to something slightly beyond what was visible. She had been married once, briefly, to a man named Carl Voss, who had worked at a tannery north of the county, and who had died of a fever in 1827, leaving Harriet with no children, a modest inheritance of tools and linens, and a last name she kept because it was hers now, and because she saw no reason to surrender it. She had no family in the area. She had instead a reputation, in a county where childbirth was among the leading causes of death for women of every social standing. A skilled midwife was not a luxury. She was a necessity. The physicians of Charlottesville were few, expensive, and frequently unavailable when labor began at 2:00 in the morning in the middle of a winter storm. Harriet Voss was available. She asked for a modest fee from families who could afford it and nothing from those who could not. She did not distinguish between the wife of a plantation owner and the wife of a tenant farmer, at least not in the delivery room. Outside that room, she understood perfectly well how the world was arranged. But inside it, when a woman was fighting for her life and the life of the child she carried, Harriet was simply the person who knew what to do. By the time the Langford family summoned her, she had been practicing for nearly 15 years and had presided over more than 200 births. The Langfords were the kind of family that Albemarle County had been built around, or so they believed, and so the county largely allowed them to believe. Their original land grant, dated to the early colonial period and successive generations, had expanded the property through purchase, marriage, and the careful maneuvering that passes for luck when it is actually strategy. By 1841, the Langford estate, formerly called Westmere, comprised nearly 4,000 acres of mixed farmland, timber, and tobacco fields, worked by the labor of enslaved people, whose number fluctuated between 60 and 90 depending on the season and the demands of the harvest. Edmund Langford, the patriarch, was a man of 58 when Harriet first came to Westmere. His wife Adelaide had produced 3 surviving children, 2 sons, Charles and Thomas, and a daughter, Lydia, before her health had become too precarious for further pregnancies. Edmund had accepted this with the public dignity appropriate to a Virginia gentleman and had in private made arrangements that were common enough in the plantation world of that era, though never spoken of in polite company. Harriet came to Westmere in the autumn of 1841 because Adelaide Langford had suffered a frightening episode during what was supposed to be a routine examination by the family's physician, Dr. Harlan Poot, and Poot had quietly suggested to Edmund that having a resident midwife available, someone who could attend to Mrs. Langford's constitution and to the needs of the household's female population more broadly, would be a prudent measure. Edmund agreed. He sent word through the county networks that connected wealthy families to skilled domestic workers. And within 2 weeks, Harriet Voss arrived at Westmere with her bag and her notebook and her watchful face, and she did not leave for 27 years. The notebook was not remarkable to look at. It was a standard ledger book of the kind that could be purchased at any dry goods store. Dark brown leather cover, sewn binding, cream-cold pages of moderate thickness. Harriet had several of them over the years, each one filling as the years passed, and being replaced by a new one. While the previous ones were stored in the tin-lined box, she kept under her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen. That was her private space. She had started keeping the notebook long before she came to Westmere. Agnes, her teacher, had kept records too. Not detailed ones, just entries noting the date, the name of the mother, the outcome. Agnes had told her once that a midwife who didn't keep records was a midwife who couldn't learn from her mistakes. It was practical advice, and Harriet had followed it. But over time, Harriet's records had become something more than practical notes. She recorded the date and time of each birth, the name of the mother, the name given to the child, the child's physical characteristics, weight estimated by feel, coloring, any notable features. She recorded the names of anyone else present. She recorded the name of the father as given by the mother, and this in the complicated world of Westmere was where her notebooks began to contain information that no one else had written down anywhere, because on a plantation like Westmere, not all births were equal in the eyes of the law or in the official family records. The births of enslaved children were recorded when they were recorded at all in estate ledgers as property inventories. The births of white children to white women were recorded in family Bibles and eventually in county registers. But the births that fell into the spaces between those two categories, the children born of relationships that the law did not recognize and the family did not acknowledge, those births were recorded nowhere except in Harriet's notebook. She did not set out to be a revolutionary. She was not a woman of political sentiment, at least not in any way she expressed openly. She was a professional, and she was thorough, and she was the kind of person who could not leave a fact unrecorded simply because recording it was inconvenient for someone else. She wrote down what she saw. She wrote down what the mothers told her, and she never showed the notebooks to anyone, not for 27 years. November 1841. The first birth Harriet attended at Westmere was not a complicated one medically speaking. The mother was a young enslaved woman named Nora who was perhaps 19 or 20. No one was certain, because her birth had not been recorded, and who had been working in the Langford house as a kitchen helper for 3 years. Nora was small and terrified and had been told almost nothing about what was coming. The older women in the enslaved quarters had tried to prepare her, but the plantation's isolation and the disruptions of the previous years, 2 deaths among the older enslaved women, who might otherwise have served as guides, meant that Nora faced her labor with the kind of ignorance that made a midwife's calm authority both practically necessary and deeply meaningful. Harriet spent 7 hours with Nora. The baby came just before midnight, healthy, a boy, and Nora wept in a way that seemed to contain both relief and something Harriet recognized as grief. The grief of a woman who understood exactly what her child's life would be. When the immediate crisis was past and Nora was resting, Harriet took out her notebook by the light of the single candle she was permitted and wrote the entry. November 14, 1841. Mother Nora. Child, male, healthy, weight estimated at 7b. No given name as yet. Father, name withheld by mother at first inquiry. On second inquiry, after assurances of my discretion, mother stated, Eel. She paused after writing those initials. Then she continued. Mother expressed fear. I administered reassurance. Child delivered without complication. Both mother and child in good condition at time of my departure. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag. Eel Edmund Langford. It was not a surprise exactly. A woman who moved through the world of large plantation households learned quickly to read the currents that ran beneath the surface. Who deferred to whom, who avoided whose eyes, who received quietly different treatment from the master without anyone acknowledging the reason. Harriet had arrived at Westmere only 6 weeks before Nora's delivery, but she had already noticed the way Edmund Langford's gaze moved when he passed through the kitchen, and the way Nora moved when he was nearby, and the way the older enslaved women kept their expressions carefully neutral whenever his name was mentioned in certain contexts. She was not shocked. She was careful. The initials ELO would appear in her notebooks 3 more times over the following 11 years, twice beside the names of other enslaved women at Westmere, once beside the name of a young woman who worked in the county town and whose connection to the Langford household was less direct, but not absent. Those entries were among the ones that years later would matter most. But in November of 1841, Harriet was simply doing her job, writing in her notebook and beginning the long process of becoming invisible. This was in its way a deliberate strategy, not a conscious conspiracy. Harriet was not a strategist in the political sense, but a practiced skill. She had learned early in her career that a midwife who made herself indispensable and unobtrusive was a midwife who was allowed access to the rooms and conversations and moments that other outsiders never saw. She did not seek this access for any sinister purpose. She sought it because it allowed her to do her work better. But over time, the access accumulated, and the notebooks filled, and the information they contained grew into something whose weight Harriet may not have fully appreciated until much later. She attended to Adelaide Langford's continuing health needs through the autumn and into winter. She established a routine at Westmere, rising early, preparing the medical supplies and herbal preparations that formed the practical core of her practice. Attending to whatever calls came from the household or the quarters, maintaining the cleanliness standards that Agnons had drilled into her. She ate her meals in the kitchen, slept in her small room, and spoke to everyone politely and to most people briefly. She was, by all accounts, extremely good at her job. Adelaide Langford survived the winter and recovered enough strength by spring that the physician-doctor, Put, expressed genuine satisfaction. The enslaved women in the quarters who had feared childbirth for years found that Harriet's presence altered the experience in ways they had not expected. Not made safe exactly, because nothing about birth in that time and place was safe, but attended to with a care and competence that made the difference between life and death more often than pure chance would have predicted. Edmund Langford paid her wages without complaint. He was, Harriet noted in a brief personal observation, tucked between entries in her second notebook, a man who valued effectiveness above almost everything else, and who was perceptive enough to recognize it when he saw it. He did not speak to her often. She was not the kind of employee who warranted conversation. But when he did, there was a quality of assessment in his attention that told her he understood exactly how useful she was. She understood something about him too, but she wrote it in the notebook and kept the notebook locked in its box under her bed. Charles Langford was 22 in 1845 and already resembled his father in a way that went beyond the physical. The same deliberate manner of moving through a room, the same habit of pausing before speaking, the same quality of attention that felt like being measured rather than looked at. He had been educated partly at home and partly at a small college in Richmond, and he had returned to Westmere with the easy confidence of a man who has been told since childhood that the world around him exists in some fundamental sense for his benefit. He married in the spring of 1845. His wife was Elenina Hull, the daughter of a moderately prosperous family from a neighboring county. A slender woman with careful manners, and an expression that Harriet, meeting her for the first time at the wedding, classified as simultaneously composed and watchful. Not in the way Harriet herself was watchful. Harriet watched things for information. Elenina, she sensed almost immediately, watched things for danger. Their first child came in early 1847. A boy delivered cleanly and without crisis on a cold January night while Charles Langford paced the corridor outside the door. Harriet wrote the entry, Mother Elenina Langford, née Halt, child, male, healthy. Name given Edmund Halt Langford, in honor of the grandfather. Father Charles Langford, husband, delivery without complication. Both mother and child in good condition. She paused as she always did to consider whether there was anything else to note. There was not in this case. Everything about this birth was exactly what it appeared to be. The second child came in 1849. A girl given the name Catherine, also straightforward. Elenina Langford was not an easy patient. She was proud and controlled in a way that made accepting help from another woman difficult. But she was physically strong, and the births went well. Charles's younger brother, Thomas, was a different kind of man. Where Charles was measured, Thomas was volatile, not violently so, but with a restlessness that expressed itself in sudden enthusiasms and sudden disappointments. in schemes that bloomed brilliantly for 6 months, and then died for lack of sustained attention. He had gone west for a period, come back, tried to establish a separate enterprise at the edge of the Langford property, and eventually settled into a role of nominal management that satisfied no one, least of all himself. Thomas was also, Harriet noted privately, a man who drank more than was good for him, and who, in the years after his return from the West, spent long periods at a boarding house in Charlottesville, under circumstances that the Langford family discussed in the elliptical language that polite Virginians used for things they could not name directly. In 1851, Thomas married a woman named Vivian Carr, a widow 7 years older than Thomas with children of her own from her first marriage. The Langford family did not entirely approve. Edmund Sr. had wanted a match that would bring land or money to the estate, and Vivian Carr brought neither, but Thomas, in one of his rare episodes of determined persistence, refused to be persuaded otherwise. And Edmund, who was by then in his late 60s and growing tired, conceded. Vivian Carr Langford was interesting to Harriet in ways she did not immediately articulate even in her notebooks. She was a competent woman. Clearly, she had managed her first household after her first husband's death with efficiency and without complaint. She was pleasant to the domestic staff, in a way that communicated awareness of the social distinctions without contempt. She had the look of someone who had learned early that survival required paying very close attention to other people's needs and finding ways to meet them before being asked. She was, in short, the kind of woman Harriet understood. They did not become friends. The social architecture of Westmere did not permit that kind of direct relationship between a midwife and the wife of the younger son. But there was over the years a quality of mutual recognition between them. They understood each other without saying so as women who had navigated difficult landscapes by being useful, careful, and underestimated. Vivian bore Thomas one child, a boy named Robert, in the spring of 1852. Harriet attended the birth and wrote the entry in her notebook with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. Mother, child, physical details. Father, Thomas Langford, husband. She did not hesitate over that entry. There was nothing in what she had observed to complicate it, but she noted in a brief personal aside that she rarely permitted herself in these records that Vivian Langford's physical condition at the time of delivery suggested the pregnancy had been a difficult one. Not medically, but in some interior sense that Harriet had learned to recognize without being able to name precisely. The kind of difficulty that came not from the body's resistance, but from something the woman was carrying that was not the child. She filed the observation in the back of her mind, where it sat alongside 100 other half-formed impressions, and continued her work. In 1853, Edmund Langford, Sr. died. He had been failing for nearly 2 years, his heart weakening by slow degrees, and his death in March of that year was quiet and expected. He was 69 years old. He was buried in the family plot at the edge of the Westmere property, under a stone that listed his dates and his name, and nothing else, as was the custom for men of his standing, who wanted to be remembered for what they had built, rather than who they had been. Harriet attended the funeral at a distance, standing among the household staff, near the back of the assembled group, as was appropriate to her position. She watched Charles Langford at the graveside, composed, formal, receiving condolences with the same measured quality he brought to everything. She watched Thomas, distressed in a visible, uncomfortable way that embarrassed those around him. She watched Elenina Langford hold her husband's arm with a grip that communicated something more than "well, I support." She watched and said nothing and went back to her room that evening and made a brief note in her current notebook. March 14, 1853. E. Langford, Sr. deceased, 69 years. Funeral attended. Estate passed to Charles' eldest son, as per general expectation. No complication observed in proceedings. She paused. Then she added in her small, precise hand, "The household will change now." It was an understatement, but Harriet was not given to dramatic predictions. She recorded what she could see and left interpretation to the future. The years between Edmund Sr.'s death and the accelerating national crisis of the late 1850s were the years in which Westmere underwent the subtle but irreversible change that happens to large households when the original source of their authority is removed. The habits of deference, the vehemence that had organized the estate around Edmund's will and judgment were replaced slowly and not without friction by the new hierarchies that Charles Langford was constructing. Charles was a capable man. He managed the property with competence, maintained the social relationships that were necessary for the family's standing in county society, and made financial decisions that, if not brilliant, were at least steady. He expanded the tobacco production, which was profitable in those years, and invested cautiously in the kind of small improvements, better equipment, smarter rotation of fields, that a man of his temperament found satisfying. What he could not control was his brother Thomas Langford. In the years following their father's death, became a source of increasing anxiety for the Westmere household. His drinking worsened. His business ventures, funded by the modest allowance that Charles administered from the estate, failed with clockwork regularity. He was absent from Westmere for long stretches, sometimes without explanation, and when he returned he brought with him an air of resentment that seemed to grow rather than diminish with time. The resentment had a specific shape, though its exact contours were not immediately visible to everyone who witnessed it. Thomas had received a smaller share of the estate than Charles. This was standard practice for eldest sons, and Edmund Sr. had made no special provisions to alter it. And Thomas had decided somewhere along the way that this was an injustice rather than a custom, and that Charles was not merely the beneficiary of convention, but the architect of his deprivation. Whether this resentment was justified or not is the kind of question that only those inside a family can answer, and those inside families rarely answer honestly. What Harriet could observe from her position was the effect. A man who had been restless becoming increasingly bitter, and a brother who had been measured becoming increasingly watchful in the way that careful people become watchful when they sense that something is moving toward them that they cannot yet identify. Vivian Langford watched it all with the expression Harriet had catalogued years earlier, composed, attentive, quietly calculating. In 1857, something happened that Harriet recorded with unusual care. She was summoned in late August of that year to a small property at the edge of Albal County, a tenant farm that had no formal connection to Westmere, but whose occupants Harriet had attended before. The woman in labor was named Margaret, surnamed Deer. She was perhaps 25, unmarried according to the county records, and had been living at the tenant farm for about a year. The birth was uncomplicated. The child was a boy, healthy. Harriet wrote the entry, and then she wrote the father's name, not because Margaret volunteered it, because Harriet, in the methodical way she had developed over 15 years of attending births across the county, noticed the way she always noticed the physical qualities of the child, the things that a woman trained to observe and record could not ignore. She asked quietly and without judgment, as she always asked. Margaret Dyer told her. The father was Thomas Langford. Harriet wrote it in the notebook and closed the cover and walked the 3 miles back to Westmere in the early morning light, carrying her bag and the weight of what she now knew. and she did not alter her expression or her manner by so much as a degree when she arrived at the kitchen door and began her morning routine. She filed the entry in the box with the others and continued to watch. 2 years later, in the early spring of 1859, Vivian Langford came to Harriet's room late in the evening, later than was usual for any visit, and with a manner that was carefully casual, in a way that communicated the opposite of casualness to someone paying attention. She asked Harriet, in the oblique way that people ask things they could not ask directly, whether Harriet had ever attended to a woman named Margaret Dyer. Harriet said that she attended to a great many women across the county, and that she considered her records confidential. Vivian nodded slowly. She thanked Harriet for her time and left. She had not been answered exactly, but she had received, Harriet sensed, enough of a confirmation to orient her next steps. Whatever those steps were going to be, Harriet did not know then what Vivian intended. She filed the visit in the back of her mind, alongside the other observations she had accumulated and did not yet fully understand, and she went to sleep, and in the morning she continued her work. To understand what Vivian Langford was doing in those years, it helps to understand what her position in the Westmere household had become. After 7 years of marriage to Thomas, she was not technically a poor woman. Thomas's allowance from the estate, while smaller than what Charles managed, was sufficient for a moderate life. Robert, their son, was healthy and growing. She had a place at the Langford table, at dinners, and at the church in Charlottesville, and at the county gatherings where the substantial families of Albemarle displayed themselves to each other in the social rituals that governed who belonged where. But her position was in the way of all positions, dependent on a single unsteady man, precarious. Thomas's absences had become longer. His debts had become more difficult to conceal. And Vivian, who was not a woman who allowed herself to be surprised when she could avoid it, had long since begun building the kind of private knowledge that served as ballast against an uncertain future. She knew, for instance, about Margaret Dyer, not from Harriet. She had not confirmed anything from Harriet directly, but she was the kind of woman who noticed things, and she had noticed the timing of Thomas's disappearances, and she had heard through the network of information that women in those communities maintained with careful discretion about a young woman on a tenant farm who had a child that people who knew the Langford family sometimes looked at twice. She had asked Harriet not for confirmation of the fact. She already believed she had that, but for something more specific. She wanted to know if Harriet had a written record. She wanted to know if the information existed anywhere in a form that could be used. Harriet had neither confirmed nor denied the existence of such a record. But Vivian was perceptive, and she knew what the careful non-answer of a professional woman meant. She did not approach Harriet again for nearly 2 years, but she began quietly to cultivate the kind of relationship with Harriet that a woman in her position could maintain without attracting attention. Small acknowledgments of Harriet's presence, occasional small gifts of the domestic kind that women exchanged across social differences, a habit of thanking Harriet in a way that went slightly beyond the formal minimum. Harriet accepted all of this with her usual composed politeness and continued to keep her own counsel. Meanwhile, the political situation in Virginia and across the southern states was deteriorating in ways that made private family anxieties feel simultaneously more urgent and less important. The debates over slavery and secession that had been building for a decade were accelerating. And men like Charles Langford, who had built their lives and their fortunes on the labor of enslaved people, but who were not at heart ideologues, found themselves increasingly pressured to choose sides in a conflict that neither side had asked their permission to initiate. Charles chose Virginia. He could not have done otherwise without losing everything he had built. But he chose Virginia with the grim practicality of a man who understands what the choice costs and has already calculated whether he can afford it. Thomas predictably was more volatile. He was enthusiastic for secession in the way he was enthusiastic for everything brightly and briefly, and then became anxious, and then became resentful that Charles was managing the family's public position without consulting him, and then disappeared to Charlottesville for 6 weeks and returned looking as though he had lived 5 years. Vivian watched all of this without comment. And in the spring of 1860, a year before the war began, something happened that none of them had planned for. Thomas came to Harriet's room. It was not unusual for members of the household to come to Harriet with small medical concerns. A winter cough, a persistent headache, the kind of minor ailment that one preferred dress before it became to him significant. Thomas had done so occasionally over the years, though with less frequency than other members of the household, because he had a slightly unusual quality of never quite looking directly at Harriet, as though there was some specific discomfort in her presence that he managed by not acknowledging her fully. This visit was different. He sat down in the single chair across from where Harriet stood at her workbench, and he was quiet for a moment longer than the ordinary small talk preamble required. And then he asked her something directly. He asked her if she kept records of the birth she attended. Harriet said yes, she kept notes, as any professional practitioner would for the purpose of her own medical reference. He asked whether those notes were detailed. She said they contained what was medically relevant. He asked whether she had ever recorded the names of fathers. She looked at him for a moment, not long, just long enough to let him understand that she had understood the question, and then said calmly that her records were confidential and that she considered the details of her professional observations to be private matters of trust between herself and the women she attended. He sat with that answer for a moment. Then he stood up, her in a voice that was not quite steady, and left. He never asked again. But the following morning, Harriet moved her tin-lined box from under her bed to a different location, one that she did not record because she was careful, and she began for the first time to think seriously about what would happen to the notebooks when she died. She was 59 years old. She was in good health, but she was not a woman who deceived herself about the arithmetic of time. She had 27 years of careful record-keeping in those boxes. She had the truth about a great many births, including births that the powerful people around her would have very strongly preferred were not documented anywhere. She thought about burning the notebooks. She thought about it seriously for several weeks, and then she decided not to. She was not entirely certain in those years why she decided not to. She told herself it was professional principle, the same principle that had made Agnons insist on keeping records, the same principle that made any serious practitioner maintain documentation of their work. It was not wrong to keep records. It had never been wrong. The wrongness lay with the event she had recorded, not with the record-keeping itself. But there was something else, too. Something she acknowledged to herself with more difficulty. She had watched for nearly 20 years what happened when the truth about certain things was allowed to simply vanish. When the births she had attended were treated as though they had never occurred. When the children she had helped into the world were filed in estate inventories or buried in county records under names that erased their actual origins. When the women who had told her things, the difficult intimacy of labor, were left to carry those secrets alone without even the small dignity of having the truth written down somewhere. She would not burn the notebooks. She would find a way to make sure they survived. The war remade everything. This is not a story about the war. The story was already moving toward its destination before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. But the war was the landscape through which the remaining acts played out, and its weight changed the texture of every decision that followed. Westmere did not suffer the physical devastation that visited some Virginia properties. It was not burned, not occupied at length, not stripped of its livestock and stores in the systematic way that the campaigns farther south produced. Charles Langford had managed his relationships with the military authorities on both sides with the same cold competence he brought to everything. And while the estate lost workers and horses and a portion of the harvest in each of the war years, it retained its basic structure. What changed at Westmere was the people, the enslaved workers in the chaotic years of the war, and then in the formal disruption of emancipation left in waves, some early when the Union forces began moving through the region. Some in the months after the proclamation, some not until the very end, when the legal framework finally confirmed what the war's momentum had already established. Their departure left Westmere undermanned, its field shrinking with each season, its financial position deteriorating in the way of all large agricultural enterprises built on the labor that had just been made illegal. Charles responded to this with the grim methodical adaptation that characterized him. He reduced the cultivated acreage, hired what free labor he could afford at the wages the market was beginning to establish, and began the long, quiet calculation of what could be sold, what could be leased, and what had to be abandoned. Thomas did not adapt. Thomas drank and quarreled with Charles and made plans that came to nothing, and in 1863 contracted a fever that the physician said was typhoid, and spent 6 weeks in the borderland between life and death before returning to a version of himself that was diminished in ways that were never entirely clear. Whether from the illness itself, or from the war, or from the accumulation of all the years that had brought him to this point, no one could say. Vivian nursed him through the fever. She did it with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything. When he recovered, she received his gratitude with polite acknowledgement and continued to watch. Harriet was present through all of this. She was in her early 60s, older than most women in her profession who were still practicing. But her health remained good and her skills remained sharp. And in the disrupted world of wartime Westmere, where the normal supply of medical care had been further reduced by the departure of young physicians to military service, her presence was more valuable than ever. She delivered 5 babies at Westmere during the war years. One was to a hired laborer's wife who had come to the property as part of Charles's post-emancipation workforce. The other 4 were to women who had been enslaved at Westmere and who in the transition of those years occupied a complicated in-between status that the formal legal categories of freedom and slavery could not quite describe. She recorded all 5 in her notebooks. She recorded them with the same thoroughness she had always applied. And for 2 of those entries, she recorded again the names of fathers, information provided in the same way it always was, quietly and in confidence during the hours of labor, when the normal social barriers temporarily dissolved. The names were not names she had expected to write. One of them was a name she had written before. She closed the notebook that evening and sat for a long time in her room, looking at nothing before she put it in the box. Before we go any further, if you've made it this far into this story, you already know this isn't the kind of history that gets taught in any classroom. If you want to make sure you never miss one of these, hit subscribe and ring the bell. The next story is already waiting. 1865-1869. Robert Langford was 13 years old when the war ended. He was Thomas and Vivian's son, the child born in 1852, whose entry in Harriet's notebook was a single uncomplicated line. He was also, by the time he reached his teens, the most promising young man in the Langford family in a generation, which was both a compliment and a burden. He had his mother's quality of attention, which was considerable, and his father's physical appearance, which was striking, tall, dark-haired, with the particular kind of presence that draws other people's eyes in a room without any particular effort on the part of its possessor. He was also serious in a way that Thomas had never been, with a genuine intelligence that the plantation school had not quite known how to accommodate, and that Vivian had supplemented as best she could with the books and occasional tutoring that wartime Virginia made possible. Charles Langford, who had no sons of his own, only daughters, after Edmund Holter died of fever at age 4 in 1851, had watched his nephew with interest for several years and had begun quietly to think of Robert as a potential heir, not in the legal sense. The estate was entailed in ways that would require significant legal work to alter, but in the practical sense, the sense in which an aging man without a male heir begins to look toward the next generation and calculate who can be trusted with what he has built. This calculation was not invisible to those around Charles. Vivian noticed it. She noticed it with the careful, neutral expression of a woman who has learned not to let her face express her thoughts too clearly because her thoughts were complicated. She had never been entirely certain how she felt about Robert. She loved him, of course, the uncomplicated physical love of a mother for the child she had carried and delivered and raised. But she was also a woman who knew things, and the things she knew cast a shadow over certain simple feelings that she managed by not examining them too closely. She had never spoken to Robert about what she knew. She had never spoken to anyone about it, not directly, not in words that could be repeated. The only person in the world who had any piece of the information she carried was Harriet Voss, who had the professional discretion of a confessor and the personal self-containment of a woman who had long since learned that what you know and what you say are two entirely separate decisions. In 1867, Robert Langford went to Richmond to study law. This was Charles's idea, and it was funded by Charles, who had arranged a place with a law firm there, and paid for the lodgings and expenses with a generosity that spoke to the seriousness of his intentions regarding his nephew's future. Robert was 16. He was young for such a step, but the war had compressed the normal time frames of education and professional entry for an entire generation of Southern young men. And Robert, serious, disciplined, genuinely capable, was better prepared than most. Before he left, he came to say goodbye to Harriet. This surprised her. He had been polite to her over the years in the way that children of the household were polite to domestic staff who had been there their entire lives, a courtesy that owed more to habit than to any particular reflection. But this goodbye was different. He sat down in the chair across from her workbench, the same chair where his father had sat 7 years earlier, and asked about her records, and he looked at her directly with those dark eyes that had always struck Harriet as carrying more weight than a boy his age should carry. He said he wanted to ask her something. She said he could ask. He said he had heard over the years that she kept records of the birth she attended. He said he didn't mean to pry, and he didn't want to know any specifics. He just wanted to know if it was true. She said yes, it was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you've seen things in this house that nobody else would have written down." I think that matters. I don't know exactly why I'm saying this to you, but I wanted you to know that I'm grateful you're careful." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. She said carefully that she had always tried to do her work with integrity, and that she was glad if it had been of service. He nodded and stood and shook her hand, which no young man of his position had ever done with Harriet before, and left. She sat for a long time after he was gone. Then she took out her current notebook and wrote a brief entry, not about a birth, but a note to herself, the only one of its kind she ever wrote. "Robert left today for Richmond. He is careful. He is watching. He is Vivian's son." She paused. She added, "He may be the only one I can trust." Then she closed the notebook and put it away. 1869–1871. Charles Langford died in the autumn of 1869 of a heart condition that had announced itself gradually and was managed by the time it became urgent by the simple application of rest, of the gradual reduction of the work that had defined his life for 30 years. He was 56. He died as he had lived methodically without fuss, having arranged his affairs with characteristic thoroughness in the months before the end. His will was read in December of 1869 in the parlor at Westmere by the family attorney, a man named Willis Kramer, who had served the Langford family for 15 years and who read the document with the neutral, professional expression of a man who has delivered both welcome and unwelcome news to enough people to have calibrated his face accordingly. The substance of the will was straightforward in its broad outline and complicated in its specifics. The estate, what remained of it, which was considerably less than the 4,000 acres of the antebellum years, the war and its aftermath had required sales and contractions that reduced Westmere to something under 1,800 acres, was left in its entirety to Thomas Langford's son, Robert, on the condition that Robert completed his legal education and returned to Albemarle County to manage the property and its associated interests within 3 years of Charles's death. The bequest to Charles's own daughters, Catherine and a younger daughter named Margaret, born in 1854, was substantial in terms of monetary value, but did not include the land, which was the specific thing that defined the Langford identity in the county's social architecture. Thomas received nothing beyond what he had already been receiving from the estate allowance, a provision that acknowledged without explicit statement what Charles had assessed about his brother's capacity to steward anything of lasting value. Thomas's reaction to this reading was not precisely explosive. He was too worn by the years, too diminished by the illness and the drinking and the long attrition of his own personality to produce the dramatic outburst that the situation might have called for in an earlier, stronger man. He was instead very still and very pale, and the quality of his stillness communicated something that Harriet, observing from the doorway of the adjacent room, where she had been asked to wait in case Mrs. Langford required anything, recognized as the specific kind of rage that is nowhere to go. He left the parlor without speaking. That night, Vivian came to Harriet's room again. She sat down in the chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she told Harriet that she needed to speak to her about something that had been a long time coming. Harriet waited. Vivian said that she was going to ask Harriet something that she had no right to ask, that she knew she had no right to ask, and that she was asking anyway because the situation had arrived at a point where the information Harriet carried was the only thing that might protect Robert. Harriet said, "Protect Robert from what?" Vivian said, "From Thomas." She did not explain further, and she did not need to. Harriet had been watching the Langford family for 27 years, and she had not spent those years in a state of inattention. She understood what Vivian meant by protect. She understood what a man like Thomas cornered by circumstance and inheritance, and the final confirmation of his own diminishment, might do if he found a way to challenge the will, to question its basis, to find a legal thread to pull that might unravel what his brother had arranged. She also understood what Vivian was asking her for. She was asking for the notebooks. Not all of them. Not the whole 27 years of births and fathers and careful notations, but certain specific entries. Entries that would establish certain facts about certain people, which in the hands of the young attorney, who happened to be the named heir, and who happened to be Robert Langford, might constitute the kind of incontrovertible documentation that made a legal challenge very, very difficult. Harriet was quiet for a long time. Then she asked Vivian something she had never asked anyone directly. She asked, "Why does it matter? What is Thomas going to find if he looks?" Vivian looked at her with the steady expression of a woman who had been carrying a stone for 18 years. She said, "You know what he'll find. You recorded it. You've had it in your box for 18 years. Silence. Robert he has to be protected." Harriet looked at the wall. Then she asked very quietly whether Robert knew. Vivian said, "No, Robert did not know." And she did not want him to know if it could be avoided. She wanted the threat neutralized without the truth having to be spoken. She wanted the notebooks to serve as a deterrent, to be the thing that existed, that people who needed to know about knew about, that prevented the wrong questions from being asked rather than answering them. Harriet said she would think about it. Vivian left. Harriet did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the dark and thought about the question of what the notebooks were for. She had told herself in 1860 that she was keeping them because burning them was wrong, because the truth of those entries had a right to exist somewhere regardless of whether anyone ever read them. She had told herself it was professional principle. But Vivian was asking her to use them, not to reveal them, but to use the fact of their existence, the threat of their potential revelation, to manage a situation in which a powerful man might otherwise succeed in taking something from someone who, in Harriet's private assessment, had a stronger claim to it than he did. She thought about that. She thought about the entry she had written in 1852, the uncomplicated one. Mother Vivian Langford, child, male, father Thomas Langford, husband. And she thought about the entry she had written in 1857 at the tenant farm. And she thought about the entry she had written in 1863 at Westmere during the war, which she had reread only twice in all the years since, and which sat in the box like a stone. She thought about Robert and his direct eyes and the handshake that no young man of his position had ever given her before. She thought about what it meant to keep a record and what it meant to use one. By morning she had made a decision. December 1869, January 1870. Harriet did not give the notebooks to Vivian. That was not what she decided, and it was not what Vivian had asked for. What she decided was something more precise. She took the relevant entries, not the originals, but copies she made herself over several nights by the light of her small lamp in the careful hand that had never in 30 years of practice become uncertain. And she placed those copies in a sealed envelope, and she gave the envelope to a man she trusted with a specific and very clear instruction. The man was a freedman named George Rules, who had formerly been enslaved at Westmere, who had left in 1864 and settled in Charlottesville, and who had been known to Harriet for years as a man of particular reliability. She had attended the birth of 2 of his children. He regarded her with the quiet respect that people reserve for those who have been present at the most fundamental moments of their lives. She told him, "This envelope is to be delivered to Robert Langford in Richmond within the week. Not through the ordinary post, by hand, by a trustworthy carrier." She told him it was important. He did not ask what was inside it. He took the envelope and left. She then wrote a letter to Robert, brief, formal, the kind of letter that a woman in her position could write to a man in his without attracting comment, which said only that she hoped he was well, that his mother was well, and that he might receive a communication from a trusted source that she hoped he would treat with the utmost discretion. It said nothing else. She sent the letter by post. Then she waited. 3 weeks later, she received a note from Robert. Also brief, also careful, that said only, "I have received what was sent. I understand its significance. Please be assured that I will handle it appropriately. And thank you, Miss Harriet." She burned the note, and she put the original notebooks back in their box in their new location, and continued her work. What happened in Richmond in those weeks, she never knew in detail. She inferred it later from the sequence of events, the way one infers the course of a hidden stream from the pattern of the trees above it. Thomas Langford, who had been consulting quietly with a different attorney about the grounds for challenging his brother's will, withdrew those consultations in February of 1870. The withdrawal was total and final, accomplished without public statement or explanation. Thomas returned to his rooms at the Westmere outbuilding and continued to drink and to diminish and to avoid as much as possible his son, who returned from Richmond in the spring of 1870, having completed his legal education at the accelerated pace that necessity demanded. Robert Langford, 21 years old, took possession of Westmere in the spring of 1870. He assumed the management of what remained of the estate with the same careful gravity that Charles had shown in his best years, and he set about the long process of stabilizing the property's finances and its position in the county. He did not speak to Harriet about what had been in the envelope. She did not speak to him about it, but when he arrived at Westmere and came to her room on his first evening there, again, this direct quality of attention that set him apart from everyone else in the household. He looked at her and said, "You've kept this family honest when it couldn't keep itself honest. I don't know how to repay that." She said, "You don't have to. Just manage the estate well." He said he would try. She believed him. There's more to this story, and where it goes next is not what you're expecting. Before we go on, take a second to share this with someone who loves history that cuts this deep. These stories survive because of listeners like you. 1872. Thomas Langford did not accept his situation quietly. This was not in his nature, and the years and the illness and the drinking had not changed his nature so much as they had stripped away the outer layers of self-control that had previously imperfectly contained it. What he did was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no public accusation, no moment of theatrical revelation. What he did was the thing that small, diminished men do when they have been maneuvered into a corner and lack the resources for a direct assault. He talked. He talked to people in Charlottesville. He talked to men at the tavern and at the county courthouse in the careful, elliptical way that people talk when they want to float an accusation without owning its consequences. He implied things. He suggested that the will's disposition was irregular. He hinted, never stated, always hinted, that there were circumstances around Robert's birth, around the question of who exactly Robert's father had been that might change certain assessments if they were properly examined. This was dangerous talk. It was the kind of talk that, in the Virginia of the immediate post-war period, operated in a minefield of competing anxieties about race, about inheritance, about the newly complicated legal landscape of a state that was technically under Reconstruction governance and had not yet fully resolved what any of that meant for the social arrangements that had defined it for 2 centuries. What Thomas was implying in the delicate language of implication was this: that Robert's father might not have been Thomas Langford, that the question of Robert's parentage was not as settled as it appeared. That if one were to look carefully at the circumstances of his birth, one might find things. He was not wrong that there were things to find. He was wrong about what they were. This distinction between what Thomas thought was in Harriet's notebooks and what was actually in them is the central irony of the whole story, and it is the kind of irony that only becomes visible in retrospect. Thomas had spent years afraid of what Harriet knew. He had come to her room in 1860 and asked about her records precisely because he feared that she had documentation of his relationship with Margaret Dyer and the child who had resulted from it. Documentation that Vivian might use, that a court might consider, that might create legal complications for his already precarious position. His fear had been of his own secrets. But the entry in Harriet's notebook that Vivian had used to protect Robert, the entry that Robert had received in that sealed envelope in Richmond, was not about Thomas's secrets. It was about something else. It was about a birth at Westmere in 1863 during the war, when the household had been stripped of its normal staff and the extraordinary pressures of wartime had altered the behavioral landscape in ways that the PC social rules had kept suppressed. It was about who had come to Harriet's room on a particular night in late 1862 and asked her to keep something quiet, and it was about whose name she had written in her small precise hand beside the entry for a birth that no one else had recorded. Thomas Langford did not know about that entry. He never had. His fear of Harriet's notebooks had been based on a correct general assessment of her thoroughness and an incorrect specific assessment of what she had actually written. What he was implying in Charlottesville was that Robert might be illegitimate in the sense that would have mattered most in Virginia's social order, that his blood might not be entirely what the Langford name required. He was not specific. He could not afford to be specific because specificity required evidence, and he did not have it. But the implication was enough to move through certain social circles with the quiet, persistent virulence of rumor. Robert heard about it. His reaction was not the one Thomas had anticipated. Instead of panic or denial, or the kind of furious reputation that would have given the rumor momentum, Robert was very still and very calm and very, very methodical. He contacted Willis Kramer, the family attorney, and had a series of meetings whose content was not recorded in any document that has survived. He contacted Harriet by letter, formal and careful, and asked whether she would be willing to confirm, in writing, the facts of certain births she had attended, if such confirmation were ever required for legal purposes. She wrote back, yes. He contacted the county courthouse and began a careful audit of the estate. Documents, the birth records, the family Bible entries, and every other piece of paper that had ever formally documented anything about the Langford family. What he found, or rather what he confirmed, because he had suspected it since the envelope arrived from Richmond, was that Thomas Langford's implied campaign was built on a specific misunderstanding. Robert's birth was exactly what the official records said it was. He was Thomas Langford's son, born in lawful marriage to Vivian Carr Langford, delivered by Harriet Voss at Westmere on April 19, 1852. The entry in Harriet's notebook was clear and unambiguous. What the notebook also contained, in an earlier entry, one that Thomas had never imagined existed, was the fact of who had actually fathered the child born to Margaret Dyer in 1857. Not Thomas. Charles Langford, the careful, methodical, morally upright patriarch, had been at some point in 1856 or early 1857 involved with Margaret Dyer in the way that Harriet had documented. Charles, whose will had bequeathed everything to Robert. Charles, whose reputation was the foundation on which Thomas's entire implied campaign was built. The implicit contrast between the legitimate heir's grandfather and whatever irregularities Thomas was suggesting. If that entry in Harriet's notebook became public, it would not destroy Robert. Robert's birth was unimpeachably documented. It would destroy Charles's legacy. And with Charles's legacy destroyed, the entire moral framework that Thomas was using, the suggestion that the respectable side of the family was setting up their son to claim what was rightfully Thomas's, collapsed. Thomas had been threatening to pull a thread, and the thread he was pulling was attached to his own family's credibility. Robert, who had read the copies of Harriet's entries and understood exactly what they contained, sat down and wrote his uncle a letter. The letter was brief. It did not make explicit accusations. It did not quote from Harriet's notebooks. It simply observed in the careful language of a trained legal mind that a challenge to the will would require the introduction of certain evidence about the family's history, and that such evidence, once introduced into a legal proceeding, would be subject to examination that might prove illuminating in ways that no one in the family would welcome. He sent the letter by private messenger. Thomas received it, read it, and did not reply. He also stopped talking 1872-1875. The silence that followed Thomas's withdrawal was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of a family that had looked at the full extent of what it contained and had made a collective, unspoken agreement to look away. The Langford family was not unique in this. Most families of their standing and their history were built on layers of suppression, on the understanding that the past had to be managed, that memory was a resource to be curated rather than a record to be consulted. They had learned this skill over generations, and they applied it now with the efficiency of long practice. Thomas died in the spring of 1874. His death was attributed to the cumulative effects of the typhoid illness he had survived in 1863 and the years of drinking that had followed. He was buried in the Langford family plot at a distance from Edmund Sr.'s stone, and the family gathered at the graveside with the solemn private expression that people wear when they are burying something more complicated than grief. Vivian outlived him by many years. She stayed at Westmere in the rooms that had been hers since her marriage and occupied a position in the household that was slightly undefined in the formal sense. She was Robert's mother, but she was not the mistress of the estate, which was increasingly managed by Robert, and after 1873 by Robert's wife, a woman named Helen Slade, who had been educated in Richmond, and who brought to Westmere a quality of brisk, clear-eyed competence that Charles Langford would have recognized as his own. The notebook stayed in Harriet's box. She had not used them, not in any direct sense. She had made copies of specific entries and sent those copies to Richmond. The originals remained in her possession in their tin-lined box in the location that she had moved them to in 1869 and which she had never told anyone. She was in 1874 73 years old and still practicing less actively than in her peak years, but still available when called, still maintaining the routines of her professional life, with the stubbornness of a woman who has defined herself for so long by what she does that the alternative feels like a ratio. She had attended, by her own rough count, somewhere between 400 and 450 births over the course of her practice. She had recorded all of them. The notebooks in the tin-lined box, 5 of them now, contained the documentation of 40 years of births across Albemarle County and the surrounding area in all their variety and complication and ordinary human truth. She thought sometimes about what would happen to them when she died. She did not have clear relatives. She had no children. She had colleagues, other women who practiced in the county, younger than she was, who had learned from her in the same way. She had learned from Agnes. But she did not feel that passing the notebooks to any of them was appropriate. The notebooks were not professional documents in the ordinary sense. They were something more specific and more weighted than that. She had Robert. She trusted Robert, but she was not certain that giving the notebooks to Robert was right, either, because Robert had a direct interest in their contents, and a person with a direct interest in a document is not the ideal custodian of that document. She thought about this problem in the slow, patient way she had always thought about difficult problems for the last 3 years of her life. She did not fully resolve it. 1875-1877. In the spring of 1875, Harriet Voss began writing something that was neither a birth record nor a professional note. She wrote it in a new book, not a ledger, but a small journal of the kind that women sometimes kept for private correspondence or reflection, purchased from the dry goods store in Charlottesville on one of her infrequent trips into town. She wrote over the course of several months what might be described as an account, not a confession. She had done nothing she needed to confess, not a memoir. She had no interest in the genre. What she wrote was a careful, comprehensive description of the notebooks, what they contained, how they were organized, what the most significant entries documented, and where the originals were stored. She wrote it in a voice that was almost entirely free of interpretation or editorial comment. The same voice she used in the notebooks themselves. Here are the facts. Here is what I recorded. Here is where it is. She did not name in this account the person or persons she intended to receive it. She left that blank with a note to herself in the margin to be determined. Over the following year, she wrote 3 letters. One was to Robert Langford. One was to a woman named Frances Hardy, a Quaker reformer based in Philadelphia who had corresponded with Harriet over the years primarily on matters of midwifery practice, and who had a quality of moral seriousness that Harriet respected. The third was to the county courthouse in Charlottesville, specifically to the office of the county, declared to the incumbent and his successors with a request that it be preserved in the official files. Each letter contained different information. None of them contained everything. The letter to Robert acknowledged the history between them, and described in general terms the existence of the notebooks and the nature of their contents. It said that the originals would be left in the care of a specified person, whose name she would communicate to him separately. It asked him to trust her judgment about how the information was managed and expressed her confidence that he would. The letter to Frances Hardy described the midwifery records in the context of a broader argument about the importance of documentation, about the way that the lives of women in certain positions were systematically absent from the official historical record, and about the way that private record-keeping practitioners like Harriet represented an essential counter rather than fictional women. We left us and the official counter are. She described the notebooks as historical documents of genuine significance and asked Frances to ensure, if anything happened to her, that they were preserved in a form that historians and legal scholars might someday access. The letter to the county clerk was the most remarkable of the 3. It was a formal statement, written in the legal register, that years of exposure to the work of men like Willis Kremer and Robert Langford had given her, attesting to the accuracy and completeness of her records, to the methodology she had used in keeping them, and to the specific categories of information they contained. She did not file it immediately. She kept it in the journal alongside the account she had written. She knew, building something, a structure, the kind of structure that could survive her, That could make the notebooks useful after she was gone without requiring anyone to act improperly or anyone to violate the confidences that she had maintained for 40 years. She was, in her methodical and unhurried way, constructing the conditions for a truth to survive. October 1877. Harriet Voss died on the 14th of October 1877. She was 76 years old. The cause of her death was a stroke, quick in the end, the kind of death that practical women who have spent decades watching others struggle through more prolonged ends often seem to arrange for themselves, as though the body, trained to efficiency by long years of use, extends that efficiency to its own departure. She had been at Westmere until the end, or not quite at Westmere, but in the small house that Robert had arranged for her in the mid-1870s, when it became clear that her health required more comfort than the room off the kitchen had ever provided. It was a modest house on a half-acre, at the edge of the property with a proper bedroom and a sitting room and a kitchen, and it was the first space that had ever been entirely hers. She had organized it in the last years of her life with characteristic thoroughness. Her medical supplies were inventoried and labeled. Her correspondence files were organized chronologically. Her professional library, modest but carefully curated, was listed on a paper inside the front cover of the first book, and the tin-lined box, which had traveled with her from her room off the kitchen to her new house, was exactly where it needed to be. She had communicated its location in a sealed letter given to Robert with instructions that it be opened only after her death, with complete specificity. She had left the journal, the one containing the account of the notebook's contents, and her 3 unsent letters in the box, with the notebooks themselves. Robert opened the sealed letter the day after her death. He found the box. He found the journal. He sat with it for a long time in the sitting room of the small house that still held the atmosphere of a person recently removed from it. And he read what she had written. He read about Margaret Dyer. He read the 1857 entry, which told him something about his own uncle and father that was simultaneously unsurprising and newly painful in its documentation. He read the 1863 entry, the one he had already known about, from the copies sent to Richmond. Reading the original was different. The original was in Harriet's hand, with the particular quality of her handwriting, small, precise, unhurried, and it made the fact more real in a way he hadn't anticipated. He read for the first time the entry about Nora in November of 1841. He read the initials EL. He thought about his grandfather, the stone in the family plot, the man who had organized this entire world that Robert was now responsible for. He sat for a long time. Then he did what Harriet had in her indirect way asked him to do. He sent the letter to Frances Hardy. Not just forwarded it. He enclosed his own note attesting to Harriet's reliability and the historical significance of the records, and asking Frances to act as she saw fit in ensuring their preservation. He sent the letter to the county courthouse, again with his own accompanying note, identifying himself as the executive of Harriet's estate and attesting to the document's legal validity. He kept the originals in their box in a locked cabinet in the estate's office at Westmere, and he left them there. He did not tell his mother what was in the box. He did not need to. Vivian Langford was 63 years old and had spent 31 years managing the knowledge she carried, and she did not need anyone to describe its weight to her. He did not tell his wife. Not yet. He was not certain in those early weeks after Harriet's death what exactly was going to happen. He only knew that something had shifted, that the notebook's existence, which had for 20 years been a private deterrent operating in the background of the family's life, had now become something more formal, more legible, more available to the world outside the Langford family's private calculations. He was right that something was going to happen. He simply did not know how exactly or when. Frances Hardy was a woman who understood the significance of documentation in a way that was characteristic of her community and her era. The Quaker abolitionist tradition had for decades before emancipation built its moral arguments on the careful accumulation of testimony, records, and evidence. The argument against slavery had always been in part a paper argument. These are the facts written down by witnesses available for examination. When Harriet's letter arrived in Philadelphia, Frances read it with the focused attention of a woman who has been waiting for a specific kind of confirmation for a long time. She had known from years of correspondence with Harriet that the Albemarle County Midwife kept unusual records. She had suspected that those records contained information of historical and potentially legal significance. She had not known the full extent of what Harriet had documented. Reading the letter, she understood. She began in the spring of 1878, a quiet and methodical effort to bring Harriet's records to the attention of people who could assess their significance. She was careful. She was not trying to create a scandal or destroy a family. She was genuinely philosophically convinced that the kind of historical record Harriet had created deserved to exist in the formal archive where historians and legal scholars could access it. She communicated with a network of colleagues, reform advocates, historians, the NAIT organizations that were beginning to think about the documentation of African American history in the post-war South, and she described in carefully general terms what she knew about the notebooks. The response was slow, as these things always were, but it was real. In 1880, a historian named A.R. Beaumont, who was connected to a university in Philadelphia and who had been corresponding with Frances about the documentation of Southern birth practices, made a trip to Albemarle County. He met with Robert Langford, presented his credentials, and made a formal request to examine the notebooks. Robert agreed. He did so with the same careful gravity he brought to every significant decision, and with an awareness that this agreement, was in some sense the thing that Harriet had been building toward for 40 years. Not scandal, documentation, the formal acknowledgement by the institutions that kept history that the things she had recorded deserved to be preserved alongside all the other things that had been preserved. Beaumont spent 4 days with the notebooks. He read every entry. He took extensive notes. What he published 2 years later was not a sensational account. It was a scholarly monograph, carefully argued, methodologically rigorous, the kind of document that was read by a small audience of historians and reformers and legal scholars who were thinking seriously about the documentation of the pre- and post-war South. But it named the notebooks. It described their contents. It quoted specific entries. It included the 1841 entry about Nora and the initials Eel. It included the 1857 entry about Margaret Dear. It did not include the 1863 entry. Robert had made one redaction, one entry that he asked Beaumont to omit, and Beaumont had agreed on the understanding that the original was preserved in the county records and would be available for future scholars. The monograph circulated in the small world of serious historical inquiry. It was reviewed in 3 academic journals. One review was reprinted in a Philadelphia newspaper. The newspaper excerpt was reprinted in a Richmond paper, and from the Richmond paper, it reached Charlotte Steeney to 1883. The response in Albemarle County to the news that a dead midwife's notebooks had been published in a Philadelphia monograph was not uniform. There were people who dismissed it entirely. Old families closing ranks in the way that old families do, treating the documentation of their ancestors' behavior as an attack on their own dignity. There were people who engaged with it cautiously, acknowledging the historical significance while maintaining careful distance from the specific families involved. There were people who were genuinely disturbed. Not because the information was surprising exactly, but because the formal existence of a written record had a different quality than the unwritten knowledge that had circulated in the county for decades. The Langford name appeared in Beaumont's monograph twice. Once in the context of the 1841 birth, the notation about Edmund Langford, the grandfather, and the young enslaved woman named Nora, whose son had grown up at Westmere, and whose adult life had taken a path that Harriet's notebook, with its precise initials, now illuminated differently than the official family story suggested. Once in the context of the 1857 birth, the notation about Charles Langford and Margaret Dyer, whose son, by the time the monograph was published, was 24 years old and working on a farm in a neighboring county, entirely unaware that a scholarly document in Philadelphia had just identified his father. The children of Charles Langford, his daughters Catherine and Margaret, were both living at the time of publication. Catherine was married in Richmond with children of her own. Margaret was unmarried, still in Charlottesville. Both women received within weeks of the Richmond reprint letters from their family attorney and visits from concerned relatives who wanted to discuss how the family should respond. Catherine said in a letter to her attorney that has been preserved, "My father was a man of his time. I cannot pretend otherwise. I refuse to be ashamed of facts that are not my doing, but I will not pretend the facts are not the facts." Margaret did not write letters. She visited Westmere for the first time in several years and sat with Robert and Vivian in the parlor where 13 years earlier Willis Kramer had read Charles Langford's will. What was said in that room has not been recorded, but afterward Margaret returned to Charlottesville and began quietly to make arrangements to meet the young man on the neighboring farm. His name was James Dyer. He was 24 years old, and he had his father's steady eyes and his mother's practical manner. And when Margaret Langford appeared at his door and introduced herself, he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I wondered when someone would come." He had known, not from any document, not from Beaumont's monograph, which had not yet reached him. He had known the way children in rural communities know things that adults have tried to keep from them, imperfectly, intuitively, through the accumulation of small inconsistencies and sidelong looks that eventually organize themselves into an understanding that resists formal articulation until formal articulation arrives. Margaret told him about the notebooks. She told him about Harriet Voss. She told him as precisely as she could what Harriet had written and what it meant for his understanding of his own family. He listened. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said she wrote it down because she thought it should exist. She was right. Margaret agreed. 1884. Vivian Langford died in February of 1884. She was 70 years old, and she had outlived her husband by 10 years and her brother-in-law Charles by 15. She had outlived Harriet Voss, who had been in many ways the most important woman in her adult life by 6 years. She had watched in those 6 years as Harriet's notebooks moved from the private deterrent they had been for 2 decades to the formerly documented historical record they had become. She had watched the monograph's publication, the newspaper reprints, the family conversations that followed. She had watched Robert manage it all with the steadiness that she had spent 30 years quietly building in him, and she had allowed herself to feel something that she rarely permitted in full. The satisfaction of a plan carried through to its conclusion, not her plan. She was careful about that distinction, even in her own private thoughts. Harriet's plan, or not even a plan exactly, a professional practice sustained with such consistency and integrity over so many years, that it had become, in the end, something larger than any individual decision. Vivian had carried for 30 years knowledge that she had never shared directly with anyone except in the most oblique and implied ways. She had used that knowledge once in 1870 to protect her son from a threat that had been built on an ironic misunderstanding. She had lived with the rest of it, the full weight of what she knew, what it meant for the family she had married into and served and survived for 3 decades. In the last months of her life, when she was too ill to leave her rooms at Westmere, but still clear-minded and still watchful, she asked Robert to read to her from Beaumont's monograph. He did. He sat beside her bed and read the scholarly, careful, methodical account of a midwife's notebooks, and Vivian listened with her eyes closed and her hands still. When he finished the relevant sections, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said she was the only one who told the truth. Everyone else was managing something. Robert said nothing. She said, "I was managing something, too."
"I know that,"
he said. "You were protecting me." She said yes, but she wasn't protecting anyone. She was just writing things down. That's different. He agreed that it was different. She died 3 weeks later, quietly, in the same practical and undemonstrative way she had lived. The years following Vivian's death were the years in which the full consequences of Harriet's notebooks worked their way through the Langford family and through the wider community of Albemarle County in the slow, patient way that documented truths always do, not in dramatic explosions, but in the gradual reorientation of what people knew and what they were willing to acknowledge knowing. The man who turned out to have the most sustained response to the notebook's publication was not a Langford. It was James Dyer, the son of Margaret Dyer and Charles Langford, who had said to Margaret Langford, in the direct, unadorned way that seemed characteristic of people who had spent their lives at the edge of powerful families, rather than inside them, that Harriet was right to write it down. James Dyer became, in the 1880s, something of an informal historian of Albemarle County's social history, not a professional scholar, not an academic, but a man who had developed a specific and deeply motivated interest in the gap between official records and actual events. He corresponded with Beaumont. He corresponded with Frances Hardy before her death in 1886. He visited the county courthouse and examined the records that Harriet had identified in her formal letter to the clerk. He found in those records things that corroborated what the notebooks contained, and things that the notebooks alone would not have revealed, the way that formal records and private records together created a more complete picture than either alone. He began to understand in doing this work why Harriet had kept her notebooks, not because she distrusted the official record, but because she understood that the official record had specific structural limitations, that it documented what the powerful wanted documented and left blank what the powerful wanted blank, and that someone who was present at the events themselves, present in the room, trusted by the people involved, writing in private without anyone's approval, our direction, could fill in those blanks in a way that no official system could. In 1888, James Dyer published a short essay in a Philadelphia historical journal, a modest venue, but one with a serious readership among historians interested in Southern social history. The essay was about midwifery records as historical sources. It described in general terms the kind of information that a skilled and conscientious midwife, like Harriet Voss, could accumulate over a career, and it argued for the historical value of such records as a corrective to the structural silences of official documentation. He did not name names beyond what Beaumont had already published. He did not need to. The argument stood on its own. The essay was read by fewer than 1,000 people, but It was read by the people who were thinking about these questions, and it contributed in the small, incremental way that all good arguments contribute to the growing understanding in historical scholarship that the archive was always incomplete, always curated by power, always in need of the supplementary record kept by those who were present, but never counted. In the Albemarle County Courthouse, the formal letter that Harriet had left with the clerk and that Robert had formally submitted after her death was eventually transferred in 1896 to the newly established State Archive in Richmond. The certificate of deposit recorded its origin: Harriet Voss, Midwife, Albemarle County, Record of Professional Practice 1837-1877. It was cataloged, given a reference number, and filed. No one looked at it for 20 years, but it was there. It existed. It was preserved. That was what she had.